Well, I'm delighted to have once again the opportunity to address the Westmont College chapel service. And I want to talk to you today about David and spiritual leadership. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to write a commentary on 2 Samuel, and that really immersed me in these wonderful texts concerning King David. And so many lessons, but I want to just draw some out now for leadership in the church. And some might, take that role very explicitly in your career, others, though, more indirectly. Nevertheless, I think all of us are called to some role of leadership in the church. Here's lesson number one. David, at his best, is someone who listened to the Lord. He was a man of prayer, of attentiveness to a higher voice. On the biblical reading, the basic human problem is always listening to our own voice or the voices of those around us and not to the higher voice of God. Go right back to the Adam and Eve story. The rescue operation begins with the call of Abram from Ur of the Chaldees, who doesn't listen to his own voice or the voices of those around him, but attends to a higher voice, and he follows it. That's the meaning of faith, everybody. Don't listen, by the way, to those today who say, faith means, believing any old nonsense based on no evidence. That's not what faith means in the Bible. It means attending to a voice beyond my own, beyond the voices of those around me. So David, the greatest of Israel's kings, at his best is someone who attends to that voice. And even in very particular things. Shall I go up to Hebron? Shall I go out against the Philistines? David listens, and when he listens, he succeeds. I love this distinction between the ego drama and the theodrama. Right? The ego drama is the drama that I'm directing and producing and starring in. The Bible's not interested in that. The theodrama, it's God's drama, the one that he's writing, he's directing, he's producing. You've got a role in it. But you've got to attend to God's voice to discover that role. At his best, David is a player in the great theodrama. One thing that leaders in the church ought never to say is, my career is not proceeding apace. Things aren't going the way I planned. Who cares? That's the ego drama language. Lord, what do you want? You've got to be, above all, in the first place, a person of prayer if you aspire to leadership in the church. Second theme now from the David stories. Don't you love the description? It's the translation from the King James. David as the sweet singer of the house of Israel. The first time we meet David in the story is when he's called to soothe the troubled mind of King Saul, and he plays the harp and he sings. And of course, the ancient association between David and the Psalms. Think too of David's great speech in the presence of Goliath. You come out after me with sword and scimitar, but I come after you in the name of the Lord God of Israel. A speech intended not just for Goliath, but for all the army of Israel. Think of David's magnificent elegy on Mount Gilboa upon the death of Saul and Jonathan. How the mighty have fallen upon the heights of Israel. From beginning to end of his story, David is seen as a warrior to be sure, but also as a singer. Someone who uses language to articulate a vision for his people and to lift them up. When I was coming of age, this is now true in the Catholic Church, not sure if it's true in your churches, but there was a kind of anti-intellectualism. A tendency to say, what ministry is all about is direct service to the poor and all this theological business. Well, you have to jump through those hoops. Look, I got nothing in the world against direct service to the poor, but I've got a lot against an anti-intellectualism that would marginalize theology. We study theology, we who aspire to church leadership, not on the off chance that someone might ask us about the Council of Chalcedon. That's not the point. The point is that we have the language which we then can use to inspire and lift up our people so that we might become sweet singers of the house of the new Israel, which is the church. Think of Abraham Lincoln now in the American setting. Specialist historians might remember the particular strategic decisions made by Lincoln in political and economic and military affairs, etc. But we all remember the Gettysburg Address. We all remember the second inaugural. Lincoln became, at that decisive moment, a sweet singer of the House of America, and that's how he led the country. You know, Churchill's the best example in the 20th century, isn't he? Again, specialist historians, I just plowed through a long biography of Churchill, might remember the particular decisions, but everybody remembers the great speeches. You know, we'll fight on the beaches, we'll fight on the hillside, we'll never surrender. I've got nothing to give you but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Churchill, at a decisive moment, led the country, lifted up the country precisely through language. He became a sweet singer of his nation. And so, those who would aspire to leadership in the Christian community, that's why you study theology. That's why you study Bible. That's why you study spirituality. That you too might become a sweet singer of the church and to lead your people through speech. You know, I go back now to the ancient philosopher Aristotle. He said all persuasive speech, and that's the kind of speech leaders have to use, has those three elements. He called it logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos, it's got to be logically structured. One reason people lose interest in a talk is it's just sort of rambling all over the place. No, logos matters. Order, reason. Secondly, pathos, feeling. If you're not communicating your passion for a subject, no one's going to listen to you. Aristotle said, people finally only listen to an excited speaker. It's true, isn't it? If you can't rouse enough interest in your topic to get excited, how do you expect your audience to get excited? So logos, pathos, and the third quality, Aristotle said the most important, ethos, which means character. People sense behind a truly persuasive speech the character of the speaker. In our context, the Christian formation of the speaker must come through, or the words are going to fall flat. Logos, pathos, ethos. Essential to being a sweet singer of the house of the new Israel. Third theme, the theme of rivalry and jealousy. It's one of the dominant motifs now in both 1st and 2nd Samuel, the battle between Saul and David. As we saw, it began well enough with David coming to sing and to soothe the mind of Saul. Saul invites David eventually into his family, and then you had the killing of Goliath, and David is a great hero. But then that decisive moment, when the women sing, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And at that moment, a dark spirit of jealousy descends upon Saul, leading to a years-long struggle between these two great figures of the house of Israel. Listen now, Israel is meant to be united in its great struggle against the enemies of the Lord. See, read that now as a great spiritual metaphor of the church doing battle with the powers of sin and death in the world. A united Israel is a powerful Israel. A united church is a powerful church. But when David and Saul fall into this dreadful conflict, that battle is compromised and all the energy is spent in this internecine civil war. May I just say, it's the favorite strategy of the dark powers up and down the centuries, to divide the church against itself. Sure, we're fighting each other, then we're not engaged in the struggle we should be engaged in. Notice how throughout the story, David is admirable, even as Saul pursues him. And as David has opportunities to attack Saul, he refuses. No, I will not lay a hand against the anointed of Israel. David is exemplary in that struggle. Until a moment, it's a curious moment in the story, when David has been so bedeviled by Saul and so wearied by this struggle that he actually goes over to the Philistines. Remember that? He becomes a vassal of the king of Gath. Now, it's a minor part of the story, but it always strikes me as similar to, at the height of the Second World War, if Winston Churchill suddenly went over to the Nazis. Well, what it shows, it seems to me, is what this jealousy and rivalry can do. even to a heroic figure like David, who resists the worst of it for the longest time. But eventually it wears him down. It divides Israel against itself, undermining the mission. You know, if you look at the great medieval spiritual masters, they talk about invidia, right? Envy. And they say the worst type of envy is invidia clericalis, clerical envy, the envy among the priests, among the leaders of the church. I think it's still true. Gosh, how often I've seen this over the years when somebody in the church has a really good idea, something we can do to help our pastoral ministry. And then the idea is brought down to the diocesan headquarters, and then this committee looks at it, and this group looks at it, and this person says, hey, well, I wasn't consulted. And this group says, yeah, but our committee is supposed to address that. And well, we tried that and it didn't work. And before you know it, this really good idea, which would benefit the whole church, is now the victim of this internecine squabbling. The church fighting with itself rather than together fighting a common enemy. Invidia clericalis undoes a lot of our work. Where's it coming from? Saul has killed his thousands, but David is tens of thousands. So now I'd rather undermine David than work with David for the good of the whole. I love this from Harry Truman, the U.S. president. He said one time, there's no limit to what we could accomplish if no one cared who got credit for it. That's a line that's come back in an almost haunting way to me a lot, because gosh, are we preoccupied with who gets credit? Who gets the honor? Who cares? There's no limit to what we could accomplish together if nobody cared about that. Hey, that was originally my idea. Well, all right, great. But what matters is it worked. Good. Or, it really bugs me because I hate that guy and it was his idea. Who cares? It worked. There's no limit to what we could accomplish as a church if we could get over invidia clericalis. The medieval masters again say the antidote to invidia is admiratio, is admiration. Not bad. If everything's grace after all, right? Who am I to say, well, this is, uniquely mine. I get credit for it. Everything's grace. Why not admire God's grace at work, whether it's in myself or somebody else? Okay, now relatedly, I love how in 1st and 2nd Samuel, unlike here in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which are wonderful, of course, have their own theological purpose, but they present a more antiseptic story of David. Not 1st and 2nd Samuel. They present David warts and all. Most famously in that wonderful story of David and Bathsheba. What do you see there? David not listening to God. Never once in the course of that story is David inquiring what God wants him to do, as he did when he was successful. Not asking God, but rather acting like God. So there's David on the roof of his palace, in this godlike position, surveying the situation. Waking, they tell us, by the way, from a long nap. And it says in the beginning of that chapter, that time of year when kings go on campaign, David was home in Jerusalem in his palace. David loved to go on campaign, right? All his life long, David was the first one in line. Why wasn't he on campaign? The trouble came when David, instead of fighting the good fight, was staying home and acting like God. From that godlike perch, he sees Bathsheba. And then it's beautiful in the Hebrew of that passage, in a series of staccato commands. He sees her, commands someone to get her, brings her to the palace. David now acting like God, directing operations. Everybody, that's always the sign of things having fallen apart. David abusing his power for his own ends. What's happened is the theodrama has devolved into the crudest type of ego drama. another side of this thing, which comes through now in the rest of 2 Samuel, is David's failure in, I call it, fatherly leadership. Think, for example, in that scene when David's son Amnon rapes his own half-sister Tamar. What does David do? Essentially nothing. That inspires Absalom, Amnon's half-brother, to take vengeance on him, leading to a terrible outbreak of violence. What does David do? Essentially nothing. Absalom escapes. In time, comes back, acts like a complete jerk, not to find a point on it. What does David do? Essentially nothing, which leads to Absalom's rebellion. What does David do? Well, essentially nothing. He slinks away from Jerusalem. My point here is, this is David's failure to take requisite action. Everybody, if you aspire to leadership in the church, sometimes you've got to take strong action. You know, I think of Shakespeare here. We all know, whether it's Macbeth or it's Richard III, these great dramas about people that are, seizing power through ambition. And of course, that's a bad thing. But look at a play like Titus, Andronicus, or a play like King Lear. What you find is not so much vaunting ambition. You find someone who refuses to exercise fatherly leadership, which leads to disaster. Now, go back to 1 Samuel, and that wonderful story, I think, in light of our present situation, of Eli, right, the high priest, his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. Eli is the high priest. Hophni and Phinehas are lower-level priests. We find out they are abusing the people, both financially and sexually. Complaints are brought to Eli. He says all the right things, but then does nothing. The abuse continues. More complaints are brought. Eli does nothing. Result? A disaster for Israel, the conquest of the army by the Philistines, the stealing of the Ark of the Covenant, the death of Hophni and Phinehas, and the death of Eli. Now, I just wonder, again, I'm speaking out of our own somewhat painful recent Catholic history here, if any of that story sounds familiar. A high priest, a high-level leader of the church, hears about abuse by priests, says the right things but does nothing, hears more complaints, says the right things but does nothing, and then disaster for Israel. That's right out of the headlines today. It's a refusal of proper fatherly authority within the church. That's where David goes bad, everybody. Stops praying, stops listening to God, begins acting like God, and also refusing his paternal authority. That's when David gets off the rails. Let me close on a positive note. Again, but I love the fact that 1 and 2 Samuel is so honest about David's failures. That's wonderful. How different, by the way, from so many other accounts in the ancient world of kings, where kings are apotheosized, kings are deified. The Bible has no truck with that sort of thing. What I want to close with is this image of David as kingly unifier of the country. How wonderful, after his time in Hebron in the south, and he gathered people around him there, but then there was this long war with the house of Saul. But then finally the tribes of the north come to David, and they say, look, we are bone of your bone and flesh of your flesh. And then David, almost like the mystical body of David, unites the country. He establishes his new capital in Jerusalem, and then in that beautiful scene, he brings the Ark of the Covenant in a great liturgical procession into the capital. What's he doing? Uniting the whole country around the right praise of God. That was the vocation, if you want, of Adam. Think of the Garden of Eden as this place that should be rightly ordered around the praise of God. In fact, it fell through sin. Now, David's united Israel, united in the praise of God. That's what it should look like. That's the purpose, ultimately, of kingly leadership. I'll close with this. A hero of mine, a mentor to me, was Cardinal George of Chicago. And, as the archbishop of a large archdiocese, he received complaints all the time from people. Hey, Cardinal, you should do this. Your Eminence, come on, get going with this. And why aren't you correcting this and do this? I'm the bishop of this local area here, and so it's in a more minor key, but I get that sort of thing too. Well, he used to say to his critics, you make these observations, then you go home and play with your grandchildren. But I receive them, and I still have to maintain the unity of this church. And it's always stayed in my mind. The primary task of the kingly leader is to keep the tribes together, is to maintain the unity of the community, that it might accomplish its great work. David failed in different ways, yes, indeed, but he remains this archetype, this icon, if you want, of Israelite kingly leadership. He's the sweet singer of the house of Israel. He's the one who, at his best, listened to God. We abide by him. We watch and attend to this icon as we aspire to leadership in the church. And God bless you all.